Hey guys, it's Jessica Leichtweisz, and I'm back here with a very special episode of Bridge the Gap. So if you follow the show every week on YouTube, you might have noticed we took a few weeks off, but we are back now with our weekly episodes. If you're watching this on television, you may not have even known because we actually were streaming a few weeks ahead on live TV. So I'm so excited. Today we have a very special treat. All of the other videos I've done as part of the Bridge the Gap series have all been done via a Zoom interview, but today I'm excited that my guest lived locally and was able to come here to my house and really go out of his way to make this interview with you. So I'm so excited to introduce my friend Kevin Galbreth to the show. Thanks so much, Kevin, for being here.
Oh, thank you. My pleasure. Thank you for having me on your show.
It's my pleasure. So we met because we have a mutual friend, and we met hiking one day on Hamburg Mountain.
Yeah, our mutual friend Dan Giavo introduced, introduced me to you, you to me.
Absolutely. And we, you told me that you were interested in being in the show because you are a professional who works with people with special needs. You also are diagnosed on the autism spectrum, and you have family members as well on the autism spectrum.
Correct. Yep. So I fit kind of all three categories of the people you tend to have on your show. I have a degree in special education. I went to school to be a special ed teacher, and right now I'm doing work with adults with developmental disabilities living in a group home setting. And I also went into this field largely based on, I'm on the autism spectrum. So yeah, I went into this field wanting to help others like me who have, special needs. And I also have a cousin who has autism.
Yeah, so it's a bit of trend that we've had people on our show, and a lot of people we had on our show that went to college, they wind up working with people with special needs. So as someone on the autism spectrum, what makes a good professional, like a special needs professional? How can I be a better professional? Because I do believe that I can teach parents the best strategies to help their kids learn. I can help parents to manage behavior, but to really understand autism, I think it needs to come from someone who has autism. So as someone who's always striving to be a better professional, how are you uniquely qualified to work with kids, and what can I, or adults with developmental disabilities, and how can I learn from you?
All right. Well, actually, my working with kids with special needs really it wasn't so much of a success story, because when I got into student teaching, I really wasn't so good at it. That's why I never really went on to become a special ed teacher, although I have a special ed degree. So I wouldn't say having autism definitely makes you, it can help because you understand people better, but everyone with autism is unique. So having autism doesn't necessarily make you a better professional for working with people with special needs or people on the spectrum. But to answer your question about how you can be a better professional for working with people on the spectrum and people with special needs, well, I think really what it demands, the qualities it demands, a lot of compassion, a lot of patience, and really a lot of really willingness to, I'd say, open-mindedness, I think is a good word I'll use. Being open-minded and really wanting to go out of your way to learn more about the person and try to understand the person and why they behave the way they do. That really doesn't fit like the conventional way, that we're expected to behave, really understanding the unique behaviors of people on the spectrum. I think those three things are what are the three best qualities to have when it comes to, really working with people on the spectrum and people with special needs in general, both adults and children.
Yeah, and I love that you're talking about understanding why people do what they do and accepting the fact that not everyone does things the same way. And one of the terms I use a lot on my channel is that somebody is differently able. It's not less able or not disabled, but they're differently abled. And I've had the privilege of interviewing, children who are maybe have some social issues but are talented musicians, or communication issues but they're talented in basketball. And so, it's amazing that everyone has their strengths and weaknesses. But people with autism often do things differently than people who are considered neurotypical or who are not on the autism spectrum. And for people in society often might look at it and not really fully understand why people are doing what they're doing. You know, for example, one of the things that people see, and it's very easy to see, and it's, you know, people immediately say, okay, that person's on the spectrum, is stimming behaviors. You know, maybe someone gets excited and they're hand flapping, or they're making, you know, body mannerisms, and all people stim, right? I mean, whether you're tapping your foot or you're bored in a meeting and you're twiddling with a pencil, it's a form of stimming, but it tends to be a little bit socially less acceptable. I would kind of to say it how people with autism spin. It's less conventional means and more obvious means. So what's actually happening, you know, in your mind? If you do you stim today? Did you stim as a child? You know, how can people understand what that behavior is?
Well, yeah, I would say I stimmed a lot as a child. Today, not really. So definitely not nearly as much as I did as a child. But today, I do think I do have like exaggerated, you know, mannerisms for expressing, you know, excitement, anger, and expressing all the strong emotions. Most notably like excitement, anxiety, and like I might rock and flap a little more in situations that make me more excited, and that kind of thing. So exaggerated expression of emotion. The self-stimming today kind of comes in exaggerated expression of emotions. But as a kid, I did more like actual different kind of self-stimming, where I was like spend like extended periods of times, you know, doing doing various things. Like I would sometimes, you know, play with, like I would fill a thing with water, and like a bucket up of water, and like would like to go like this with it, playing with the water, watching the bubbles. That was an example of something I did a lot as a kid. And I would be like, and I would like do it while replaying, like I think very like things, some of the thinking about the things that like some of my special interests, like it might be like some of the scenes from my favorite movies, or like replaying some of the old, you know, old, like when I got into sports, like replaying some of the you know, old plays of old sporting events, you know, that kind of thing is. And that was like, you know, something that gave me like pleasure, you know, that would be like my brain was wired that doing that kind of thing gave me pleasure that it wouldn't necessarily give a neurotypical, you know, person. Yeah, but I kind of grew out of that over time and don't really do that as much. Don't really do that anymore today.
Yeah. So obviously when you were playing with water and you knew it, and you know, you could tell as I did it because I enjoyed it, it gave me pleasure. And even if someone else doesn't understand it, it was, for you, it was good. But things when you were, like you said, you were rocking back and forth, and even today sometimes if you get excited, your mannerisms are exaggerated. You know, one of the things that parents always ask me is my child doing this consciously? Are they doing it on purpose? Or is it something, and you know, a lot of parents use the phrase they can't control, or you know, I tend to like to phrase it as something that they're not even aware they're doing. So for you, when your mannerisms are exaggerated because you're excited, is it something you consciously do on purpose to calm down? Or is it something that you don't even realize you're doing and just kind of happens?
A combination of both, I would say, because I am conscious of doing it, but at the same time, can I really fully control, you know, doing it? I would say no, because when I'm you know, excited enough, I'm probably going to do it no matter what, even though I'm conscious. It's like an automatic, you know, it's sort of like an automatic reaction, but I am conscious of it as I'm doing it.
Okay, so it's kind of like a reflex. So it's
reflex,
difficult.
yeah.
Yeah, so it's difficult to stop it.
I mean, if I really, really tried hard, I probably could stop it to an extent, but you know, it takes a lot of really concentration to stop. It would take a lot of concentration to stop. Yeah.
Yeah, and one of the things I always tell parents and I work with specifically kids, and I use a behavioral approach to helping children, among other approaches, but the main approach I use is a behavioral approach. And I always tell parents, okay, if our main goal for your child is communication, we can't focus on always redirecting the stimming behaviors. Number one, it's not really, to me, ethical. I mean, if they're not doing anything that's harmful to someone else. Now, obviously, some kids and parents are watching this, they might say, well, my kid, you know, engaged in stimming by hurting himself, like banging his head on the floor or pulling his sister's hair. Obviously, we can't let kids do that. But if it's something that's harmless, and they're not hurting anyone, it's just fun for them, sometimes it's better to let them do it. And sometimes, as a professional, my belief is that if we're focused so much on stimming, we're asking children to concentrate on, stopping those behaviors, we're actually taking away their ability to concentrate on the language lessons. So would you agree with that, that if, as long as the stimming behavior is safe and, it's not necessarily like preventing them overly from being in a social situation, like, for example, if a child stands up and starts screaming, they obviously can't go to a movie theater, they may have a hard time, going to a restaurant, then that's something we need to stop. But if it's not something that's hurting anyone or seriously interrupting their social interactions, should we just let kids stim?
I would say yes. I tend to err on the side of yes of that. If the behavior is not harmless to themselves or others, and not distracting or disruptive to themselves or others, then I would say yes. I would err on the side of allowing it to go on. I mean, I think the main reason why parents and professionals would try to discourage it and say stop it is because it's it makes them, just because they're worried about looking weird in front of their peers, and then their peers like not wanting being weirded out about hanging out with them and ostracizing them, and like the goal, and like I think the number one concern of like every parent of someone on the spectrum is, since social skills development tends to be a big challenge, is are they ever going to have normal age appropriate peer relationships, and so they're concerned, they're really concerned about trying to normalize their child as much as possible to normalize them as much as possible, so that they're not like left out of social situations out of like their peers thinking that they're too weird to include. And I understand those concerns. However, I think the movement more needs to be in the direction of like educating the peers without disabilities, their neurotypical peers, that just because this person is different doesn't mean that they don't have something valuable to offer you as being part of your peer group, and and like really educating them on how they're different, and getting their peers to understand them more, and I'm very encouraged by the direction things are going in today. I think there really is a more movement in that direction right now, such that kids on the spectrum today, in spite of looking more weird, I shouldn't say, because that's not a good word, but looking different to their peers, like there's a better success rate for them being included in I think social events these days. I think there's definitely a better success rate these days among kids on the spectrum, because there's been a lot more education on autism and educating kids on not leaving somebody out just because they're different, not bullying. That's another whole thing, in addition to leaving out like the kids who have come across as different are often the ones that are targets for bullying. But there's also the big bullying campaign. I think anti-bullying campaign has really helped reduce the rates of that. I mean, I'm sure it still goes on, and I'm sure we still got work to do. I'm not really in touch enough with really fully with what goes on in schools today, but I get the idea that it's a lot better today than it was like 20-30 years ago.
Yeah, and you and I are relatively the same age. We were, and I'm 33, so, and how old are you again?
33, so we're the same
so exactly
age.
The same age. So, when we were in school, very little was known about autism. There was a lot of stigma about it, and the numbers of autism were much lower. And I talk a lot about that being the history of what autism is and how autism was treated, quote unquote treated, 30, 40 years ago. And even the very first treatment for autism was called a parenectomy. And you might have heard that term before if you have watched the show before, but the official cause of autism was refrigerator moms. It was moms who didn't love their children. So the assumption was if the child was taken from the parent's home and they were not around the evil, horrible mother, that the child would improve and they would not be autistic anymore. And so there was this huge social stigma associated with autism. So people didn't want to get a diagnosis. And then, people were really afraid of kids with autism. They didn't know what it was. And, today we live in a world that's so much different than it was 30 years ago. I mean, this show could not have been possible. The technology didn't exist. And so much more is known about autism. And I think that education, like you said, it solves problems, which is why I encourage people watching this show, share this even with your friends that don't have, that don't have autism, maybe your friends that don't have kids with autism. It's important everybody knows, because today, we're all going to experience going to a restaurant and seeing a family with autism, having a meal and a child having a meltdown, or being in the grocery checkout line and, seeing a child who's having maybe what looks like being naughty, and to, having a meltdown because they saw their favorite gum and their parent won't buy it. And really, we don't know what's really going on through that child's head or what that family's facing. And sometimes even just the looks of judgments that we can give someone and really not know how much it's really hurting them. The awareness and education is so incredibly important. And also the thing that social media has done, and such a positive thing for the autism community, is brought together other adults with autism. So there really was no community of adults with autism. That's a big part of what I'm doing on the show, is to really helping to unify the community and also give the adult autism community a voice to talk to professionals and parents and talk to us about what we're getting right, what we're getting wrong, how can we be better professionals, what about autism do we misunderstand? And just social media has connected that community. Because before, if autism was, they say 1 in 10,000, I don't believe it was ever really that low. I think people weren't being diagnosed. But even if it was 1 in 500, you could have been diagnosed with autism in a small town and never met another person with autism. Whereas today, people can go into Facebook groups and LinkedIn groups and Instagram, following each other and talking and having conversations and DMing. And there's like this awareness and this community that didn't exist before. So for me, it's a really positive thing. And you told me, and we haven't talked about it on the show, that you're diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome.
Correct. Yeah.
Which 30 years ago was a diagnosis. It was actually a diagnosis when I started working with kids, even just 12 years ago. But today, Asperger's syndrome is no longer part of the new DSM-5. And for this community of adults who were diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome, having had that diagnosis taken away, and now it's autism's level 1, 2, and 3. How do you feel about that? Do you think that it's a good thing that everything's called autism? Do you feel like, we need to go back to the way it was? What are your thoughts about that?
I would say I have mixed feelings about that. I kind of have heard arguments on both sides of when they were talking about taking Asperger's out of the DSM and replacing it with like autism 1, 2, and 3 that they have now. And I understood, I kind of thought both arguments had good points, and I was in college studying special education right when this was being talked about, and I thought both arguments really made some good points. I think on the one hand, you got like it made sense because I felt like Asperger's is largely, in a nutshell, autism without the delays in language and intellectual development that you often see in full-blown autism, that you usually see in full-blown autism. So, and I thought Asperger's can kind of be summed up that way, and very well in that way, autism without the delays in language and intellectual development. But at the same time, I also understand the arguments on the other side that say that they're two separate conditions that have a lot of similarities, that people would like, people on this side of the argument would like say either it's more, you would compare the two conditions like using a Venn diagram where they overlap in a Venn diagram where things overlap. That's what they have in common, but then they have too much not in common, that they ought to be two separate conditions. So really, I'm still to this day, I'd say, on the fence. I get both. I understand both arguments, and hard to say which side of it I'm really on. But I'll say I personally do tend to identify myself, rather than as having autism or being on the autism spectrum. I do tend to identify myself more as like being an Aspie, like I have Asperger's, so, and I use that term for explaining my diagnosis more. So I guess I have a slight leaning bias towards keeping the Asperger's label in the DSM, towards that's the way I would have gone.
Yeah, and I find that even as a professional, I can see reasons on both sides, and I think a big part of it had to do actually with just funding sources and really getting more kids services. But it's come at a cost, and there are a lot of similarities, and then there are differences, and I think it creates confusion for parents as well. But now you talked about bullying, and now being someone, like you said, who had Asperger's, you were not less aware than your peers of what was going on, but you didn't necessarily fit in with your peers. So is bullying something that you faced a lot as a child?
I would say more minimally. I mean, I would say, yeah. Did I get picked on some? Yes, but I would say not. But I would say minimally compared to a lot of my peers who have like Asperger's or autism or any kind of disability.
So that was very fortunate. And
Yeah.
as an adult, one of the things that parents ask is, okay, is my child being diagnosed with autism? Because there is a lot unknown, and because autism is a big spectrum. And, you have people like yourself who can go to school and get degrees and have friendships and can work and support themselves. And then you also have people who will require more support and who are much more disabled, and even people who struggle to do everyday things for themselves. So you have this huge spectrum. So I like to kind of share examples of parents, of people who really are independent and are really successful in every right that every adult human is. Do you find today that autism still is something that does it create struggles in your life? That it's still something you struggle with, or is it just who you are?
It's who I am. It's part of who I am, and yeah, it's part of my identity. Yes. Does it? And yes, I would also say it still to this day creates struggles. There are a lot of challenges, barriers that I still really. I've come a long ways, I feel like, from when I was in grade school, but there are still a lot of things, a lot of challenges and barriers that I do face in day to day, in pretty much everyday life and overall functioning, that I wouldn't say it's like that I wouldn't say that it's like it doesn't still create challenges for me.
Yeah, and are you open to sharing some of the things that autism makes or Asperger's makes harder for you?
Well, I still haven't really gotten over my social anxiety. So I would say, like, to this day, like, really feeling comfortable in large groups of people is, sitting in large groups of people is not something I tend to feel. I tend not to be in my comfort zone in that situation. I've to this day haven't really been in a legitimate long-term romantic relationship. The idea of like approaching a girl and like asking her out on a date is still the biggest example probably of where I really is like an anxiety that pretty much all of us experience, like when we're in adolescence. But I never grew. But with my autism, Asperger's, I never really grew out of it. I'm in my 30s right now, and employment wise, I am gainfully employed full time, but I'm working in like I'll call myself underemployed because I have a degree, but I'm working in a job that requires only a high school diploma, and I'm making, not making as much as I should be making given my experience and given my experience and my qualifications, credentials, So those kind of things. So I'm not. So that's why I would say, yeah, it's still. I'm still am significantly impacted by that challenges that I am still challenged in a lot of areas.
Yeah, and one of the things that I think that has come up a lot in this show, and I think that we're starting to see, not only because of this show, but I hope the show it does help in part with that. But we're seeing society leaning towards helping adults with autism and understanding that they do need services and they do need supports, and it may look different than supports that children needed. So for a lot of time, the belief was that kids eventually kind of grew out of autism, and they would look at someone like yourself and say, okay, well, you can take care of yourself, you can get a job, you can go to school, and they would say, well, you're fine now, you don't need any more support. But we know that's not really true, that just because the support is different than someone needed in the past, it doesn't mean that it's not there. And I believe there's a need for social skills training even into adulthood, and teaching even just social media, and teaching how to hold jobs. A lot of, and then I know you said to yourself you're gainfully employed, but a lot of people on the spectrum, they have a hard time in the workplace. And do you think that there should be more support in place for adults with autism or Asperger's, so that way we can still help? Like, it's not that people turn 21 and magically like everything's okay now and they're left to their own devices, unless they're severely disabled and need to be in a group home. But for people that are working and living independently, should there still be services?
Yeah, I would say there probably does need to be an expansion of services for adults on the spectrum, and we probably we probably appear as adults on the spectrum, who I think especially tend to appear more high functioning than they really are. Well, not to say that we aren't high functioning and capable individuals, but at the same time we have challenges that probably a lot of people do tend to take for granted. Like, people would probably look at me and look at my conversational skills and look at the fact that I have a job and I drive a car and all that, and wouldn't really see how there's any how I have any kind of disability today. But you'd have to get to know me more before you would see that, yeah, I do still really have a disability, and so yeah, I would say, yeah, probably there do need to be more services for like adults on the spectrum, adults with autism on the spectrum, the high functioning ones who might appear to be have less of a disability than they actually do.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I don't like to use the terms high functioning and low functioning. And I had another guest on the show who said, one day someone could be high functioning and 5 minutes later they could be low functioning. And one person can be really high functioning in one area but really low functioning in another area. Like, for you, you're an incredible speaker, and you even have a podcast, which I want to talk about next on the show. But you said, you have a hard time approaching women. So in that area, maybe you struggle, but in this area, you really excel. And I think everyone's like that. And I've never heard anybody refer to themselves as low functioning. I've heard people say I'm high functioning, but I've never heard anyone say there's low functioning. I think all of us, even people who are neurotypical, quote unquote, we have low functioning moments all the time. I know I have my meltdowns myself, right? We all have moments where we're not able to function. And I think that obviously it's different for someone with autism, and it happens more frequently and maybe to a higher degree. But to me, a person is a person, and I think that it's really just helping everybody with what they struggle with most to be successful. So would you agree, I know you're used to the terms high functioning, low functioning. Do you think there's a such thing as high versus low functioning, or do you think it's just everyone has their struggles and different, they change every day and they're different every day?
Well, I would say I do think yeah, there is certain people who are higher functioning than others, they're obviously somebody like me is higher functioning than someone who can't live on their own and lives in a group home, but I think there is but I think there's definitely it's high functioning, low functioning is a very gray area. It's like a spectrum, much like there is with autism. Yes, everyone, people with disabilities and people without disabilities will have their good days and their bad days, and their days where they're high functioning and days where they're low functioning. So none of us are really steady, consistent on a high functioning or low functioning all the time. All of us throughout our lives are really up and down in our level of functioning. That I agree with, definitely.
Yeah, and that's what the DSM-5 was trying to solve, right? When it talks about, rather than saying high or low functioning, and saying, or taking away the Asperger's, which is autism, which was the terms for high and low functioning 20 years ago, but it's saying needs support, or needs moderate support, or needs minimal support. It doesn't need as much support. So I think it's all based upon that, like you're saying, but I don't know that we've actually hit the real solution. And I love having these conversations because I hope that it helps to bring up some answers. That way we always, like you said, we're moving in a good direction. We continue as a society to move in the right direction. So before we close tonight, I want you to talk about your podcast. Do you have a podcast? And can you share with us what that is, why you started it, and how people can watch it?
Sure. Yes, it's a sports podcast. One of my favorite. I'm a big sports fan. It's one of my favorite things to do in my leisure time is watch sports. So, can remember, and with one of unique talent I have is remembering old sporting events. That's almost like a little savant talent I have, because I can remember games from 20 years ago in great detail. So and it's So yeah, me and Jessica's mutual friend who introduced us, Dan, kind of it was my idea. I said I kind of felt like, if him and I, give such really good, thoughtful, detailed analysis to all the hot topics in sports, I was thinking, oh man, I could see us on the radio, like doing this, and a lot of people really enjoying listening to us. So so I proposed the idea of him of like, do you know, I like one day went to him and said, do you know anybody who could help, get us started on creating our own sports podcast? And I knew, since he has so many contacts, he's the one who's really like the king of having all the right connections and contacts. He got us set up with this guy, Richard Quinn, who is kind of like a producer of a small, independent radio station called Rockland World Radio, and we brought in, and then Dan brought in one of our other friends, John, Jonathan Ober, and because he's somebody who also, like me, can really, remember like games from a long time ago and give like, and like tie the, and like compare, make good, analytical comparisons to then and now, and we've been doing it now for about 6 months. We started like late July, last August was our first show, and we do it once a week. It's every Monday from 4 to 5, and though we're going to be changing our hours soon when we're doing it, probably with Dan, starting a new job that's going to have he's going to have a different schedule, and we put all of our shows on Facebook pretty much, and we're also our last show was also on YouTube, and we're going to try to, I think we'll, try to make a point of putting our shows on YouTube as well as Facebook to kind of expand our, but we're called the Three Amigos Tri-State, sports talk show. So look us up on Facebook, and you should be able to find some of our shows on Facebook if you look up on Facebook, Three Amigos Tri-State Sports Talk Show.
Awesome, and we'll link to that in the comments of this video below. So if you want to see it, you can just check it out. So thank you so much for being on the show. It was really a pleasure to have you on here and learn from you tonight.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure to share my experiences with you.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you're watching this, thank you for watching our show. I really appreciate you taking the time out of your busy day and your busy life to learn from us. So if you want to watch more of these episodes, you can find my YouTube channel at getautismanswers.com. If you want to be on the show, someone who wants to be on the show, or if you have questions about autism you want me to answer, go to my website. It's hopeeducationservices.com. A form will pop up. Just drop in your name, your email, and that's the best way to reach me. So thank you so much. And again, this is another episode of Bridge the Gap. My name is Jessica Leichtweisz. I'm the CEO of Hope Education Services, and it's just my passion to help parents better understand autism, not only from me teaching them how to help their children, but by talking directly to adults with autism or children with autism that are able to talk about their experiences. So thanks again, and we look forward to seeing everyone next week.